So why are some nations overall doing better than others?
Today, I will attempt to answer this question by taking a non-traditional route, especially as the COVID pandemic has once again shown humanity that sometimes the most impactful things are unseen. And because the idea came to me in the shower. Before I can begin though, it is certain that historical bonds play a huge role. However, I intend to focus on our modern history, particularly the 20th and 21st centuries, a time of relative peace, progress, and interconnection. There are numerous reasons why a nation can be objectively considered prosperous nowadays. Still, I aim to find the one factor which might perhaps contribute the most to that. So, what do you think it is? Let's first consider natural resources. Surely having tons of rare and useful materials which Britain can't steal anymore would make a nation wealthy. Right? Think again. In fact, we have substantial proof that countries in this position have less economic growth and development in comparison with nations that have less natural resources, such as fossil fuels. This paradox is called the resource curse. How about population? Having tons of it must be pretty awesome, right? Well, yes. USA, Russia and China are currently amongst top 10 most populated countries in the world, and they are doing pretty alright, as a large population obviously translates to more manpower, thus a more productive workforce, and a bigger army. Still, an extended population requires extremely well-thought political and organizational systems, and very often it's a great playground for corruption to show its ugly head. In other words, while great, it can be a problem. While having hundreds of millions of people living in the same land as you sounds great. I would like to propose a factor which many of you may have not thought about after I will give two nations as examples of why this is meaningful and even try to illustrate how a lovely but considered not so powerful, nevertheless promising, country of Europe could perhaps be in a much better position worldwide if people would indeed take this into account. I am saying people because in its simplest form that's what a country really is, a large group of people. Okay, what is it? In my opinion, it's one's mentality as an individual and the nations as a group. Allow me to explain. Towards the end of World War II, Japan was on the brink of collapse, left alone after its allies of the Tripartite Pact. Germany and Italy have been defeated, having suffered the impact of not one, but two atomic bombs launched by the USA. Emperor Hirohito, who some say had actually never wanted for things to go this far, but had been forced by Japan's own military and their desire for conquest, toward the end of the conflict has twice addressed his subjects via radio. Never before have they been able to hear their emperor, whom they viewed as a god. I mean it, kinda the same as if Jesus would personally address Christians nowadays, speak to them in such a manner, saying that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the continuation of the conflict would mean not only the destruction of Japan, but of the world itself. Whoa. Not your everyday anime waifu. But also, in very few words, he instigated his people, who again viewed him no less than a god, to work and focus on development, so that Japan would never again be left behind and could contribute to the future of the world, as in the past they have traditionally isolated themselves from it. Basically, with his words, he pushed his subjects to adopt a work efficiency-based mentality, which can be easily observed today, 75 years later, when we talk about Japan's academic achievements and work ethic. A change in the nation's mentality has made Japan, from an underdeveloped and isolated nation, to nowadays a leading free market economy, the third in the world, all in only 3/4 of a century. The Second World War has given us the opportunity not merely to have witnessed and analyzed in retrospective the madness of which human beings, if not careful and able to think for themselves, are capable of, but also to observe the willingness of certain peoples to reconstruct, better themselves and their societies, and never again fall into such dangerous ideological traps. Therefore, I find it most appropriate for my second example to be the Germans, and their well-known work culture, at least here, in the West. Being the initiator of the conflict and one of the most brutal participants, also being on the loser's side, Germany had been crushed, especially in the East, by the USSR as revenge for having been invaded by them in the earlier stages of the war. After many of its young men have given their lives for the dream of the Third Reich to come into being, losing many of its territories, crushed in defeat, split into two until 1990, just 30 years later, Germany of today is not only a dominant economical power, the fourth in the world, but one of the leading figures of the EU. So how did they do it? How, if not through people's mentality, which does encapsulate their wish for better lives, for a work well done, no matter its nature, and through meaningful purpose and the desire to preserve their traditions and independence. Remember that many countries which are not doing so well nowadays also had powerful industries and the natural resources after the war. And still. As humans, while our behavior is very much dictated genetically, we are also greatly influenced by our environment and what we learn and imitate from it. No group of humans are genetically superior over others, that is common sense. However, if you have grown up in an environment which, let's say, encourages laziness and does not value education at all, in general you may be very different when having become an adult in comparison with someone who has grown up in the opposite sort of circumstances. I say in general because sometimes people who grow in unfavorable conditions rise up and become the very contradiction of them. A great historical example of that would be Alexander Hamilton, but many people do it all the time. Unfortunately, they are the exception, not the rule. Okay, no, cool, but why should I care? Well, if we entertain the proposition that our mentality could indeed affect where we are in life so much, then perhaps we should all strive to adopt the most useful one we can. Mentality for myself meaning our principles, values, goals, work ethic, perspective and morals, all of which unseen, still all of which, if carefully chosen, could certainly make our lives better as individuals and thus as a group. However, this is for you and myself to do, to choose it for ourselves, because only you should and must intelligently choose and take responsibility for your life. Next, I will show in an oversimplified manner how the modern mentality of a country was formed to what we see today. By this, I will also propose that, perhaps through a change of mentality, these people and us could indeed have much better lives, if we truly try to. Before I go on, I do not intend to insult anyone or make them feel uncomfortable. If anything, I would love to know that this video has prompted people into action for bettering their lives in their communities. The next country is very dear to me as I have been living here for many years. The reason I am showing it as an example is not to mock it in any way, quite the contrary, to try to help in my own way. All that being said, the Romania of today has indeed a rich, so be it difficult history. It as a country had been continuously invaded by others who were trying to subjugate it as much as possible, ranging from the Romans in 103 after Christ to the Ottomans, Austro-Hungarians, Polish-Lithuania and more recently the Soviet Union when, although technically independent, Romania was in part a puppet of. Gee, give them a break. Many, including these historical events, have no doubt shaped Romania's mentality of today, not just its current position on the world stage. I will give a simplified picture for the ones who may not be familiar with this beautiful country. Modern Romania as a country is quite young, coming into being in 1866 under King Carol I, German at his roots but loving of Romania and proud of his duty as king. He has won its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1877-1878 war, won the Second Balkan War in 1913, adding South Dobruja to Romania's territory, and stood strong as an example of discipline, honor, duty and boundless love for his country, an example for its subjects, for whom he showed a lot of respect. In his will, in 1899, he wrote, "Everything for my country, nothing for myself," leaving most of his possessions to country's institutions. He died in 1914. Under the new king Ferdinand I, Carol's nephew, and his queen Maria, Romania was on the winning side of the Great War, finally proclaiming the unification of all ethnic Romanians under one flag. Invading Hungary, their historical rivals as well, Romania finally found itself in a respected position as a state of Europe. The period that followed between the two world wars is considered the most prosperous. However, I believe that is when things began to change in Romania's mentality. Perhaps not for the better. You see, at the time, after witnessing the atrocities of modern warfare, not many believed that a new world war conflict would actually arise. Even fewer wanted such a thing. Except a little Austrian mustache men, maybe. For the first time, Romanians were wealthy, respected, had not to obey or fear any foreign power. Thus, even though contributing to our world enormously through scientific discoveries and modernization, due to their position, many of the Romanians decided to also waste a lot of time too. They became careless, thinking that the good times will last forever. They never do. While in the past many have been corrupted and undisciplined, now they were carefree and hedonistic. And this hedonism could have not been more of a characteristic of their new king, Carol II. You see, after Carol I had died in 1914, Ferdinand and Maria took over until Ferdinand's death in 1927. However, in 1925, Carol II renounced his rights to the throne of Greater Romania, making his youngest son, Mihai I, who was only 5 years old at the time, the new king with the help of a regency council until he was of age. He ruled only until 1930, when his father returned and was restituted as king. From 1930 to 1938, the idiot Carol, as I like to call him, had attempted in every possible way to create an authoritarian regime with him at its center. He loved lavishing parties and could not care less about the well-being of his subjects who, due to his formidable predecessors, believed in the crown. The American historian Stanley G. Payne described Carol as the most cynical, corrupt and power-hungry monarch who ever disgraced a throne anywhere in 20th century Europe. In the words of the British historian Richard Cavendish, he was dashing, willful and reckless, a lover of women, champagne and speed. Carol drove racing cars and piloted planes, and on state occasions appeared in operetta uniforms with enough ribbons, chains and orders to sink a small destroyer. Oh! Before asking him to come back, the politicians of the time perhaps believed he would bring stability to the country. They could have not been more wrong. Thus, when the Second World War broke out, Carol had cowardly gave up the territories of northern Transylvania to Hungary, backed up by the Germans, Bukovina and Basarabia to the Soviet Union, and South Dobruja to Bulgaria away, without a fight, enraging the population until he was made to abdicate in 1941, and Marshal Ion Antonescu took over, establishing a military regime and seeking to get those lands back. Mihai I was made king until 1947, when he too was forced to abdicate by the communists and fled his beloved country. Speaking of Mihai, we should take the opportunity at some point to talk more in depth about him, as I believe he is worthy of all of our respect.
You may know him better from this picture.
After the Second World War, after Romania had technically been on the winning side, after changing sides, the country was occupied by the USSR troops until 1958 and communists took over until 1989. While until 1965 Romania very much obeyed Moscow, after Nicolae Ceausescu came to power, it began to, let's say, take its own initiative. Now, for about 30 years, we have a democratic Romania, of which some of its historical territories are still controlled by foreign powers. The years of obedience and corruption had been cemented into Romanians' collective consciousness, polluting their mentality until they could break free after the revolution of 1989. We can see the effects of that today, when, even though it's hard to admit, the vassalage tendencies are very much present, as Romania is very obedient towards NATO and EU powers. Issues can be observed in its political and organizational system, the healthcare system, the educational system, which is old and ineffective, but perhaps the most in the many people's willingness to simply immigrate in the hope of making a better life for themselves, and also not to mention the old, rigid and very much corrupted mentality due to the years of oppression or their individual bad tendencies, lack of ambition and work ethic. In one word, I'll say it again, in their mentality. Still, there is hope. Through a change of mentality which embraces a strong work ethic and pride in what one does for a living, through embracing positive values like righteousness, fraternity and positive change, through striving to be virtuous and valuable for the society and on an individual level. All of which seems truly present in some of Romanian people. In combination with the country's still unique position in Europe and in the world, its current wealth and what the land has to offer, I believe that sooner than not, Romania could once again claim its place as a respected, developed, and beloved country by us all. It's up to them, and when it comes to our lives, it's up to us. Thanks for watching.